Tantra Illuminated with Dr. Christopher Wallace is a journey through the depths of the human experience, as viewed through the lens of the tradition called non-dual Shaiva Tantra. This multi-format podcast delves into the fascinating world of classical Tantra and its intersections with philosophy, neuroscience, psychology, human development, and the broader world of spirituality.
This week's episode is a conversation, and I'm speaking with Dr. Bernardo Kastrup. Bernardo is the executive director of Essentia Foundation, a new foundation dedicated to exploring the nature of reality with a lot of brilliant thinkers and authors associated with it. Bernardo has a PhD in philosophy, focusing on philosophy of mind, and another PhD in computer engineering. As a scientist, Bernardo has worked for CERN and has also had a 25-year career in technology. And nowadays, his work is leading the modern renaissance of metaphysical idealism, the notion that reality is essentially mental. That is, everything that exists is consciousness or mind, with a capital M, as it were. He has 11 books on this subject, including Why Materialism is Baloney, More Than Allegory, and his newest book about to come out, Analytic Idealism in a Nutshell. I'm very happy to be speaking with Bernardo because his work is fascinating as an alternative way of talking about the very same view on the nature of reality that the great tantric masters of 1,000 years ago enunciated. And as far as I can tell, reading Bernardo's work in some depth, though not all his books, the view really is exactly the same, even though different language is used to describe it. So, of course, in Tantrik Shaivism, we say everything is consciousness and consciousness is everything. And it's described using different metaphors, like this entire universe is one being whose body is all observable phenomena and whose soul is consciousness. This is, of course, just one of many ways of describing the nature of reality as being essentially mental, as Bernardo puts it. That is to say, there's nothing but mind or consciousness. Of course, those two terms, mind and consciousness, are often not interchangeable, but they can be interchangeable in some contexts. And indeed, many Buddhist authors use the word mind with a capital M to mean consciousness or mind at large, which is another phrase Bernardo prefers, as opposed to the ordinary everyday thinking mind. So this is a deep topic, and as you'll hear, the conversation goes into some deep places, and it assumes some knowledge on the part of the listener. So I've recorded an afterword, and if you're not at all familiar with Bernardo's work, then you might want to hear the afterword first, as it will allow you to make better sense of the conversation that we have. You can see many videos on YouTube of Bernardo giving lectures and having conversations, including some wonderful conversations with Rupert Spira. So I hope you enjoy this conversation. I'm here with Dr. Bernardo Kastrup. Welcome, Bernardo.
Thanks for having me here, Christopher. It's a pleasure.
And of course, you have two doctorates. In European convention, does that mean I say doctors Bernardo Kastrup? I don't know.
I have a friend who, since I got my second PhD, makes a point of calling me Doctor Doctor, but it's meant as an insult because in Dutch culture, titles are frowned upon. It's you're trying to distinguish yourself from the rest of us. No, we are all in the same boat here.
Yeah.
And yeah,
Well, I will have introduced you more properly before this, so we'll just dive right in. And I'd love if you could share a little bit about your journey, your intellectual and personal journey to the view of idealism. That is to say, what were the initial insights or contemplations or experiences that started leading you towards the view of idealism? Like, how did you start down this path, which ended up, here? And let me just tell the listeners that not only do I find your view of analytic idealism beautifully articulated and thoroughly articulated, I actually would go so far as to say that it's amongst the best descriptions of the underlying nature of reality that humankind has ever come up with as of now.
thank you,
So,
sir.
yeah, so it's a huge contribution. Of course, it stands on the backs of some giants like Spinoza and Schopenhauer and Berkeley in the Western tradition, and it corresponds very, very closely to the view of the great idealists of the Indian tradition, which unfortunately are not well known today, except to scholars. They're not that well known in modern India, um, like Abhinavagupta and Utpaladeva. But at any rate, this beautifully articulated view of the nature of reality, in essence, of course, is that everything is consciousness and consciousness is everything. You prefer the term mind, but if we put a sort of capital M on mind, then we certainly mean the same thing. Um, and I believe the adjective analytic idealism, that the analytic refers to the fact that you can arrive at this understanding of the nature of reality through reason and reflection. um, but perhaps you want to explain the term more, and again how you came to this view in the first place, and take as long as you like in that description, please.
Well, first of all, thanks for the kind words. I perhaps can take some minor credit for the clarity of the description, but not for the conclusion described, because those conclusions have been with us for at least 3,500 years, if not more. I didn't discover them. I may have discovered them anew for myself, but not in the name of humanity. Um, the word analytic, the aim is to immediately convey the notion that this is a philosophical articulation that belongs in the school of analytic idealism, as opposed to the continental tradition in European philosophy. So members of the continental tradition that everybody has heard about would be Nietzsche, Kierkegaard, Hegel, Kant. And analytic philosophy was founded in the early 20th century in England by Russell and Wittgenstein. And the idea was to have conceptual clarity, to have discipline in how we convey a message, so the message is not ambiguous or dubious or unclear in some way. So analytic philosophers pride themselves in having a very clearly and unambiguously articulated argument, whether it's right or wrong. And that's what I try to do, even though in my heart I am a continental philosopher, because there is much more humanity suffused in continental philosophy, while analytic philosophy is more akin to what Nietzsche described as the philosophy of a frog with frozen entrails, which he made a point to say he is not. Um, Analytic philosophy tries to sort of take a step out of our own humanity, which makes sense because our emotions can lead to a lack of clarity, to a lack of judgment. So I understand it, but it's a matter of balance. So on the one hand, I convey a analytic argument while being, on the other hand, a continental philosopher deep in my soul. Now, how did
And just to clarify, sorry, just to clarify, you were referring to two early 20th century figures, right? Bertrand Russell and Ludwig Wittgenstein.
correct?
Yeah, okay, great.
Correct. They were the first who tried to come up with this clear and unambiguous articulation of philosophy. Wittgenstein did that famously in the Tractatus, which one could wonder, is that clear at all? But it was at least an attempt at being clear. Russell also famously worked with Whitehead in the Principia Mathematica with an attempt to ground mathematics in pure logic, Aristotelian logic. Famously failed since Gödel's incompleteness theorems proved that it is impossible to ground mathematics in the logic of formal systems in a way that is complete and accurate at the same time. But that was part of the zeitgeist of the early 20th century. Logical positivism, analytic philosophy, these attempts to have total clarity and sort of divorce ourselves a little bit from the unpredictability of our own humanity. But there is value in our own humanity. So that's why, by heart, I am a continental philosopher. Um, how did this come up? I first studied computer engineering, computer science. That's the topic of my first PhD, all the way back to the spring of 2001, 23 years ago now. Almost exactly 23 years ago. It was April 2021. Um, and my first job was at the big European accelerator just outside Geneva, CERN, European Organization for Nuclear Research. I was part of the team designing the data acquisition system for the Atlas experiment, which would be part later of the Large Hadron Collider. And I was solving the problem I have in my hands with classical physics algorithms. The problem was to identify data, whether it's data possibly from new physics or old physics. And if it is old physics, we don't record the data. And if it is new physics, we would have to record the data. So, how do you decide whether it's new or old physics? One way is to apply our human understanding of physics. That's the first thing we did, and it worked, and that's what is online right now. But in parallel, almost illicitly, we also did artificial neural networks. And we wanted to find out, can we train an artificial neural network to make this discernment, this distinction between possibly new or old physics, just as well as a physicist? And turned out we could. We achieved the same level of discrimination. And it was not chosen because AI at the time was kind of obscure. It was a black box. We didn't have the visualization tools we have today. So it worked, but we didn't quite know how or why. It just worked. So we didn't use it, but it stayed in my mind. I could make a artificial system that was just as intelligent as a physicist, a human physicist, for the task at hand. What would it take to make it conscious like a human physicist is conscious? What would it take to have the calculations performed by the system be accompanied by experience, just as the calculations in the brain of a physicist are accompanied by experience? That question stayed with me for a few years, all the way into the 21st century. I was at CERN in 96, 97. So into the first decade of the 21st century, I was thinking about that and then hitting a wall because everything I could imagine I could do with the system, I could change in the system, I could re-engineer or enhance or bring into the system, only gave me reasons to think that its structure and its function was different, but it didn't give me any more or any less reason to think that it is or isn't conscious. And I realized that I had taken a wrong turn. At some point, I took a wrong turn. it simply made no sense to try to create consciousness out of physical structures. There was an impassable bridge between these two domains, an arbitrary connection between the two. So I tried to retrace my steps. Where did I make an assumption that I didn't examine thoroughly enough? And I realized that the faulty assumption was that consciousness is something that is created in the first place. That it is correlated with measurable physical states is obvious. Our experiences are correlated with certain brain states. But the idea that because of that correlation, there is a causation that the brain generates experience in some way, or that a computer can generate experience in some way, was faulty. Experience was itself primary, and matter was an appearance of experiential states. And trying to articulate this for myself at first in a way that made sense to me took me a few years. I needed a new worldview because what I realized is that my reflexive materialism was not sustainable. It didn't stand to even superficial scrutiny. It failed to explain all experience, and therefore it failed to explain everything that we know to exist, because our entire lives is a set of experiences. And that effort eventually brought me to analytic idealism, which then was pointed out to me, and then I figured it out myself after some people indicated it to me. Is uh, very compatible, if not identical, to the idealism that one can find in old literature, old scriptures from the Indus Valley thousands of years ago. And that, of course, to me was reassuring. My trip was not a trip of discovering something nobody had discovered before. My trip was to have a narrative in terms of which I could relate to the world in my own life in a healthy way, closer to truth. So that reassurance was valuable to me.
Yeah. So this is interesting because you're saying you arrived at this view, or your earliest formulation of the view, by examining the assumptions, the fundamental assumptions you were holding that had not been examined, and to see if a different starting point could account for the nature of experience more efficiently and parsimoniously. Is that right?
That's correct. Yeah, it was a rational inquiry, not and therefore it entailed some degree of introspection, but not introspection in the spiritual sense.
Yeah. So we can come to the spiritual perspective in a bit. I'd like to briefly try to describe the idealism of the authors that I study, who I mentioned, Abhinavagupta and so on, and then have you respond from the perspective of analytic idealism. Um, so, as I mentioned, in this view articulated 1,000 and more years ago, everything is consciousness, or everything is mind at large, as you put it, and that correspondence is fairly precise, because um, as a metaphor, these authors speak of um, the consciousness that the entire universe instantiates as the consciousness of a single being, as it were, but this being is not a person. Um, and so we could, use the word God, that the mind at large is what some people understand by the word God, but not what other people understand by the word God, because of course in many religious traditions, God is a supernatural, superhuman being separate from his creation. And in this view, all that manifests is the very substance of this one being. So there's no dichotomy of creator and created. Um, and there's no plan beforehand in this non-dual view. We're not talking about a supernatural being who plans a universe and then makes it according to his plan, but rather that the all phenomena are the self-expression of that one mind or consciousness or being. and yet without embodied nodal points of that consciousness, like human beings and other sentient beings, there's no capacity for self-reflection or self-awareness of this one being. So the tradition talks about everything is the light of consciousness, using a Sanskrit word that means that the light of consciousness, the illuminating capacity of awareness. Everything is that, but not everything has that self-aware, self-reflective capacity, which is instantiated only in embodied conscious beings like humans, and whatever other beings we consider sentient. And so each human being or other sentient being is sort of like a node within this singular being that is not separate from it or different from it, but instantiates that capacity of self-reflection, and therefore can imagine itself to be separate, because the capacity for self-reflection then generates the possibility for mental constructs which are more or less accurately reflecting the nature of reality. And if they're less accurate, then that being can sort of enter into a something like a state of delusion where it imagines that it is somehow separate from the whole, and that it is limited by uh, its i- its body, and its thoughts, and that it is nothing but its body and its thoughts. Um, and in one of your books, Why Materialism is Baloney. It's a great book. Um, you give the metaphor of the whirlpool, which I also use in my teaching, where the whirlpool is not separable from the ocean or the river in which that whirlpool arises. It's the same water flowing through that whirlpool that is everywhere else, right? And it's a pattern, it's a structure of energy within that wider context, and yet it has its own um, uh, durability. It has its own nature. It's a bigger whirlpool or a smaller one. And then you go further with the metaphor than I've ever seen anyone go, whereby the cone of the whirlpool, of a very rapidly rotating whirlpool, can go very deep and become almost a little world unto itself, like the conscious being can imagine himself or herself separate from the whole. And I thought this is a, you have a tendency to push metaphors as far as they can go, but with a good reason. Like it really serves a purpose. If we say, oh, and the whirlpool or the ocean is made of mercury, so it has these reflective capacities, then it makes the metaphor do more work than it otherwise would. Um, so anyway, I this is very much the view of the tradition that I study. The difference being that the starting point for this understanding is not usually philosophical reflection and speculation, but something like mystical experience, where the mystical experience in question is something like, if we take the metaphor of the whirlpool, that the whirlpool um, loses some of its uh, 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 what, I don't know what the term would be, centripetal force, or centrifugal force, one of those, that it loses some of its force temporarily and almost merges back into the broader ocean, and in which case that vantage point of consciousness, this being in this tradition the best description for what individuality really is, that it's a unique vantage point that the one has on itself. So that vantage point, remains a vantage point, but loses some of its um, separateness or individuality, and gains access to the broader perspective, and that mystical experience then starts this journey towards realization of the nature of reality, which Abhinavagupta argues must be both intellectual and experiential, that not just one or the other, that it needs to permeate and penetrate all aspects of our being to be complete. Um, so that would be, one difference is that people can spontaneously have this sort of mystical experience that's that we could talk about as oneness, but it's actually something considerably deeper than oneness, and hard to put into words. um, and so, in a sense, you and I, or whoever else we met at a site, we're arriving at the same conclusions, though our initial approach is from two different angles. And what often happens is that people who've had this experience and realize, wait, I'm not a separate entity after all. In fact, there's not even an I here, except as a mental construct. There's just this energy which flows in one way in this vicinity, and in a different way in the broader context, but it's the one and the same energy or consciousness or being. And then people who, having had that experience, search for words, search for, because they want to understand, or the mind wants to understand, and then they stumble across something. People stumble across my book, Tantra Illuminated, which gives some language to this, or they stumble across your work. And in either case, if it seems to describe what they realized but can't put into words, there's a deep excitement. It's like, wow, this is saying what I experienced, but I couldn't say. And even if the experience was not complete, not thorough, but just a glimpse, then people who stumble across these words, they're like, this is speaking to what I somehow know but didn't know on the level of mind. And you address this in a couple of your books, this insight as almost like remembering, but not remembering on this individual level, but it's a sense of, oh, I knew this somehow, but now that understanding is crystallizing. So anyway, uh, that's some words from me, and what comes up for you when you hear all that.
This is our third conversation. I haven't heard in any of the three you say something of significance that I didn't agree with. So it will come as no surprise to you that I agree with what you said. I may use different words to talk about it because I come from a different angle, from a different background. But in terms of substance, I think we are largely saying the same thing. In Why Materialism is Baloney, my one of my earlier books, I used a lot of freewheeling metaphors because I felt the need to help people find a way to imagine what I'm saying, to give them more degrees of freedom for their imagination, to see how they can conceive of these things in a coherent, internally consistent way. But of course, that doesn't replace a more explicit, clear, and direct exposition of what the ideas are. Otherwise, things remain ambiguous. The latter I've tried to do in other books, like The Idea of the World and Science Ideated, or in the latest coming this year, Analytic Idealism in a Nutshell. But in general terms, I will say back to you what you just said to me, but using my own words. So maybe it helps the audience get used to the core idea that underlies both sets of words, yours and mine. Under analytic idealism, there is an external world. Idealism does not dismiss the existence of states out there that are not parts of our individual minds. What it says is that those external states are too mental states or experiential states or states of consciousness. They are not your consciousness as an individual, as a seeming individual, but they are conscious states nonetheless. And what seems to separate us from the external world is a psychological condition that in psychiatry is called dissociation. It's when one mind seems to become many by compartmentalizing different subsets of its cognitive states, of its cognitive contents. So one segment of that mind remembers only certain things and has certain character dispositions, while another subset of that mind remembers only other things and has other character dispositions. Since the turn of the century, with the advent of neuroimaging, we know dissociation is real, and it can even render you literally blind, even though there is nothing anatomically wrong with your visual system. So it's a thing that exists in nature. So under analytic idealism, living beings are what dissociative processes in this broad field of subjectivity that the nature is. It's what those dissociative processes look like. Under analytic idealism, there are only mental states or experiential states. I use the word mental in this very broad sense that encompasses all experiences. There are only experiential states. But when experiential states are contemplated from across a dissociative boundary, what they look like is matter. So my individual experiential states, the experiential states I identify with Bernardo Kastrup, when you observe them, what you see is my body, my material body. When the mental states of nature at large are observed from across your dissociative boundary through your eyes, they look like the matter that constitutes the physical universe. So, under analytic idealism, there are only mental states, and what we call matter is itself a mental state, a perceptual state, the colors we see, the sounds we hear, the flavors we taste. Um, but these material states, which are also mental states, are the extrinsic appearance of yet other mental states when those are observed from across at least one dissociative boundary. Now, this can all be reduced to what are these states, right? Are there a multitude of states out there? No. What I mean by states are particular patterns of excitation of only one field of subjectivity. That is what nature is. That's what nature is, one field of subjectivity, one guitar string, if you will. And when that field of subjectivity gets excited, it plays a note, like when you pluck a guitar string. And a guitar string can produce many, many different notes depending on how it's excited, depending on the particular pattern of excitation or vibration that it takes on. So under analytic idealism, there is only this universal subjectivity, this universal mind or universal consciousness, whatever you want to call it. And all experiences with their enormous richness and variety are different specific patterns of excitation of this one universal subject. And we are it. We just seem to be separated from the rest of it because of a dissociative boundary that arises naturally. Now, since not all life seems to have self-reflection or metacognition, as technically called, the ability not only to experience, but to know that you are experiencing and then ponder those experiences. This higher level mental function doesn't seem to permeate all nature. I don't think amoeba have it. Mosquitoes don't seem to have it. Plants don't seem to have it. Only more evolved living beings like us, maybe some cephalopods, some cetaceans, pachyderms, more evolved animals like whales, dolphins, us, elephants, higher primates, maybe octopuses, seem to have this metacognition, this conscious metacognition, this ability to not only experience, but to cognize, to know that you are experiencing and then ponder about it. So that seems to be the result of evolution. And therefore, life itself, which may have a reason for reasons that we are not able to understand, or maybe for no reason at all, as a play of chance, because life creates this seemingly dissociated and individual centers of awareness within a broader context, a broader cognitive context, an ecosystem, which has limited resources, and therefore these dissociated complexes need to sort of eke out a living, compete through evolution. That seems to be what drove the expression of these latent higher level capabilities in the mind of nature, such as self-reflection. It seems to be, at least all evidence seems to point at it, that it is because of the evolution of life in a planetary ecosystem that self-reflection, which was a potentiality in the mind of nature from the get-go, became expressed and actually manifested itself. And because of that, it seems that only living beings can manifest these higher level mental functions, because the rest of the mind of nature never had to compete within the context of a planetary ecosystem with limited resources. So its mentation is spontaneous. It was never stopped on its tracks and forced to contemplate the higher questions and forced to introspect. Its activity is spontaneously expressed. But we have been forced to stop on our tracks and contemplate what's going on if we are to survive. And therefore, we have now this ability to sort of, as Jung put it, perform a second act of creation by taking explicit metacognitive account of the first creation. This imbues creation with a whole new level of cognitive existence. So it seems that nature values this.
It seems that nature values this. I just lost the last word.
That was it. That's where I finished. It seems
Oh,
that
okay, okay.
nature values this, what I just said
Yes,
before.
great. Okay, so let me just draw out the one of the implications here, and this is something that you've said, but you didn't make explicit there. Just as um, what I call the physical body of Bernardo is a partial image from an outside point of view of the mental processes associated with the that whirlpool of consciousness of Bernardo. In the same way, when I look at the Milky Way, when I look at nature on the broadest possible scale or on a smaller one, uh, what I'm seeing is the partial image of the mental processes of mind at large, of the wider context of consciousness that is not dissociated. Is that right?
Correct. Correct. Yeah.
Yeah. So this is, the phrase external world can be potentially misleading or problematic, right? Because most people understand external world to mean external to consciousness or external to mind, and of course you're not saying that. And it's really a figure of speech, isn't it? Because well, it depends how you're using it, but you're using it just to mean um, external to relative to the partially dissociated individual, because that boundary you spoke of is not a hard boundary but a completely porous boundary, right?
Yeah. Yeah. So what ultimately there is only one field of subjectivity in nature. That's my position. And therefore there is no outside or inside, because there is no reference for us to talk about an outside. An outside in reference to what? This field of subjectivity is the sum total of what there is. So the external internal dichotomy doesn't exist. However, I I feel it's important when I talk to people. The people that are attracted to my work are probably not statistically the same people that are attracted to yours. I usually get people who need permission from their own intellect to entertain certain ideas. They don't come at it from a purely experiential perspective. They are hard-headed, like I am, which is sort of a handicap, but a handicap that I came to embrace in my own life. I feel the need to acknowledge the illusion. I feel the need to acknowledge that there seems to be a world that is external to us. And we can even say that the world actually is external to your dissociative process, to your individual mind, but you aren't your individual mind. You are the sum total of everything. It's just that you are undergoing dissociation, so you lose sight of the rest of what you actually are. But from the deluded perspective of a seemingly individual mind, there is indeed an external world. And if I deny that delusion, and look, a delusion is not nothing, it exists as a delusion. And in that sense, it can be honored. If I deny that, people just throw their arms up and say, well, now we can't even start this dialogue because you're denying what is obvious to me. So I acknowledge that there is an external world from the perspective of the dissociated individual mind. I don't acknowledge that this difference is fundamental. It is a kind of epiphenomenon. It's emergent. It is a symptom of the condition called dissociation. Uh, but as a delusion, it is there. And people should not have difficulty acknowledging the possibility of external states that are nonetheless mental, because we are awash with examples of this. For instance, my thoughts right now are experiential in essence. They are fundamentally subjective. From their own point of view, my thoughts are subjective. But from your point of view, my thoughts are external to your mind. You cannot have my thoughts directly. I need to communicate them to you through words. If you were not there talking to me, my thoughts would still be here. From your perspective, my thoughts are external. From your individual, deluded perspective, my thoughts are external. They are still mental, but they are not part of your seemingly individual mind. And in exactly the same way, my point is the rest of the universe, too, not only somebody else's thoughts, the rest of the universe, from its own perspective, is also mental. It's also experiential. And just as my thoughts present themselves to you in the form of material brain activity, that's what my thoughts look like from your perspective, so does the rest of the universe look like physical nature, because physicality or matter is what mental states look like when they are observed from across at least one dissociative boundary. Even when you look down and you see your body, you may say, well, how come is it external, right? Because if my body is the extrinsic appearance of what I am, then if I am the looker, then it shouldn't be material. No, of course it is material, because you are going first out and then back in when you look down to your body. Your retina is picking up photons that bounced off your skin and went into your retina. Those photons are external to you. If you want to have direct access to the mental states that you are without the intermediation of representations, images, appearances, then you can only do that through introspection. That's what Schopenhauer did 2 centuries ago. He realized that if he would drop perception, something would remain: the will, our impetus to be, to think, to feel, to act. Those experiential states. Under idealism, those are the thing in itself. Those experiential states are what we are. And our body is simply how those experiential states present themselves to external observation from across one or more dissociative boundaries.
Yeah, and this is very interesting because it explains quite neatly why there's such a profound difference. If you really pay attention, there's such a profound difference between the act of looking at the body and then closing your eyes and letting go of that body image thoroughly and experiencing the body from the first person perspective. That experience from the first person perspective doesn't have such a close relationship actually with the second person perspective of the visual image of the body, right? Because if we really go into that first person perspective of body, it's a cloud of sensations that often isn't even particularly body shaped. you
Yeah,
know
yeah. So the qualities of perception are very, very different from the qualities of being, the qualities of our internal mental states, but they correlate with one another.
yeah.
And you can I will use a metaphor now. I don't resist because I know from experience it helps. Think of a pilot in an airplane. He has a dashboard. The states of the dashboard correlate with the states of the sky outside. So you have an air humidity meter in the dashboard, and depending on where the needle of that dial is, that gives you an indication of what the humidity level of the sky outside is. Same for air pressure, wind direction, and all kinds of other things that are on a pilot's dashboard. So the states of the dashboard correlate with the states of the sky. They are a representation of the sky. They contain accurate information about the sky, because what the dashboard does is show measurement results. But the dashboard qualitatively is very different from the sky. A storm, as displayed on a set of dials with needles moving inside, is very different from the actual storm outside the airplane. Nonetheless, the pilot can fly by instruments alone. The pilot doesn't need a windshield to see the storm. A pilot can fly safely, navigate around the storm, and land safely without ever seeing what is actually outside. Commercial pilots need flight by instrument certification, so they all can do that. In the same way, the suggestion that I'm making is that what we call the physical world is a dashboard representation. It conveys accurate information about the world because it is correlated with the world. Perception, the screen of perception, is our internal dashboard. It's how our measurements of the world, made through sensors like retinas, eardrums, surface of the skin, and so forth, those measurements are presented to us in the form of physicality. That's our internal dashboard. We need to take it seriously, just like a pilot needs to take his instrument panel seriously, otherwise he'll crash and burn. The problem is that we are pilots who look at the dashboard and say, the dashboard is the world. Not only is it useful to navigate the world, not only is it correlated with the states of the world, it is the world. The dashboard is the sky outside. This is forgivable because we've never seen the sky. We never had a transparent windshield to see the world around us as it actually is. Why? Because it would be deadly. It would imply that there is no upper bound to our internal entropy. So if we were to mirror the states of the world inside, since there is no upper bound to the entropy of the world, there would be no upper bound to our internal entropy, and we could just melt into hot goulash soup. So we can't see the world as it is. Also, evolutionarily, evolution is about fitness, not truth. We didn't evolve to see the world as it is. We evolved to see the world in whatever way helps us survive and reproduce. So we make that mistake. We are pilots who think that the dashboard is the world. In other words, physical appearances are the thing in itself. That's naive, is downright silly, but it is forgivable because, again, we've never had a transparent window to see the world. We can't, we would die. We wouldn't be able to survive. So we think the dashboard is the world, and now it's the job of a little deeper thought to realize how nonsensical this is, because it leads to all kinds of insoluble problems like the hard problem of consciousness or the combination problem of panpsychism. That's not what's going on. What's going on is that out there are mental states which seem to be external to us because there is dissociation. Dissociation happens in nature. Physicality is only our internal dashboard representation of those mental states on the other side of our dissociative boundary. And if you understand this, then you understand that life is what dissociation looks like. So death is just the end of the dissociation, the reintegration of consciousness into its cognitive surroundings. It's not the end of consciousness.
Yeah, and here there's an important point because the listener might be confused and imagine that through mystical or spiritual experience we can see the world as it is in itself, but that's not the case. Because what you're talking about, like seeing the world as it is in itself, would I mean, it's literally impossible while you're experiencing through the mediation of a human brain and a human body, because seeing the world as it is in itself would constitute seeing experiencing all the information instead of this small subset of the information, and that's literally you say it would turn your brain to soup, but it's just literally impossible through a brain,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Yeah.
Look, to experience the world as it is in itself, you would need to be the world, because
Yeah.
you would need a first person perspective. That's what experiencing the essence of the world means. If you aren't the world, or you seem not to be the world, and you're merely perceiving the world, Now, what you can be acquainted with is how the world presents itself to your apprehension, not how the world is in itself. For the latter, you need to be the world, which of course you are. And when you die and the dissociation ends, that's exactly what you will experience. You will no longer perceive the world, you will be the world, which is what you have been all along. And you'll be exactly in the same place where you are right now, just not deluded by the dissociation. Um, Having said that, and I go back to Schopenhauer now, early 19th century, Schopenhauer went on board with Kant when Kant said the noumenal, or the world as it is in itself, is inaccessible. All we have is the phenomenal, in other words, how the world presents itself to observation. But Schopenhauer then amended it and he said there is only one exception to this. There is one instance in which we can experience the thing in itself, and that is us, because we are us. We don't need to perceive us. You can be in a perfect sensory deprivation chamber, a flotation tank. So you cannot see anything, you can't hear anything, you can't smell anything, you can't touch anything, you can't taste anything. And there still is something it is like to be you. You will still be having your thoughts, your emotions, your drives, your fantasies. That is the thing in itself. And since the thing in itself, in our case, presents itself to external observation as the matter that constitutes our body, and since the matter that constitutes the rest of the universe is made of the same kinds of atoms and fields of the matter in our body, then we can infer that the thing in itself, when it comes to the world out there, is of the same kind as the thing in itself that we can reach through introspection, through self reflection, through inquiry. And therefore, if there is unity between these two things, then there is a sense in which we can see the thing in itself through seeing what we actually are ourselves. And I think spiritual traditions have been hinting at this for a very long time.
Yeah, and there's no good reason, no compelling reason to suppose that the wider context of being has a fundamentally different nature than that being accessible to us through direct experience of our own subjectivity. That's one of the points you make.
Yes, I think without our ability to metacognize, there would not have been the second act of creation that invests reality with this new level, this higher level of concreteness, which is not only its own spontaneous expression of what it is, but the knowing that it is doing that. This self reflective, metacognitive, meta apprehension of existence, like Jung put it, a second act of creation through us.
Yeah, and let me just highlight one thing that even though it's not possible to see the world as it is in itself through the senses, it is possible through a particular kind of mystical experience to sense it at least partially. And what I refer to is the experience where even though you're seeing the same thing visually and hearing the same things through your ears, the sense of there being objects, of there being a world of objects external to you and imposing itself on you, completely dissolves. And in this mode of experiencing, there are no objects. Um, and what you feel is it's like you feel this that everything you're perceiving is a single ocean of energy, for lack of a better metaphor, or an ocean of vibration, and that all that you're perceiving, they're just the harmonics, as it were, of this vibratory field, um, as opposed to discrete objects. So it's somehow we're in this experience, we're sensing in a way that I can't describe, but it's not through the ordinary senses. Something else is coming online, and we're sensing something of the underlying nature. Now, if there's still at least a partial, even porous dissociative boundary, then that sensing is not full fledged, but it's at least a kind of experiential taste of the nature of reality, even though the visual field and the other sense fields don't uh, change in terms of what you literally see.
Yeah, I think this is not only plausible, it's completely expectable. Let me make a couple of comments on this. We are rooted in reality because we are part of reality. We are segments of reality. We are never completely out of touch with what is actually happening. So, underneath the layers of illusion, we are still in contact with what is. So that may percolate through the trunk of the tree all the way into the canopy up here in the head. At some point, it must still be informing our metacognitive experience of the world in nuanced ways. Another point is that no process in nature is absolutely perfect. When it stops raining, the water on the ground doesn't evaporate immediately. When something is burning, not everything that is combustible is actually combusted. Some is left behind. No process in nature is perfect. Why would dissociation be? It is illogical to think that dissociation too would be perfect and would completely isolate us cognitively from what is really going on. So I think different people have dissociative boundaries that are more or less porous, more or less permeable, allowing for more or less direct cognitive commerce with the actual states of the world around us. It's just that our culture, with its narratives, doesn't give intellectual validation to these possibilities. So when these things emerge, we would tend to dismiss them, not take them seriously, or not make anything out of it, even if we do take it seriously. It's a kind of hypnosis, a kind of um, it's a funny state of mind that we have
Mm.
because we are cultural creatures that operate with layers and layers of conceptual narratives in between us and reality as it is. Um, Another point to take into account is that if regular brain activity is part of what the dissociation looks like, you would expect that certain things that impair or reduce regular brain activity should also, in some instances, reduce the dissociation. And lo and behold, that's exactly what we observe. Psychedelics reduce brain activity. That's the primary physiological mechanism of psychedelics. They reduce brain activity. They don't light up your brain like we used to think. For the past 12 years, we've known that it's the opposite. And part of that reduced brain activity is probably the dissociative process itself, which is then reduced, amortized, and the boundary becomes more porous. And some of what we see in a psychedelic experience may be part, or some of what we experience during a psychedelic trance may be part of our cognitive surroundings, although a lot of it is part of our own, our own skeletons in the cabinet. Forgot the expression. Um, so
in,
these are
in the closet.
in the closet. Yeah, yeah. So these are all things to take into account. It is entirely legitimate to give intellectual validation to the possibility that in some circumstances, spontaneous or not, you can actually have cognitive commerce more directly with the external states of the world, not intermediated through the dashboard. And now, because our minds operate through synthesis, that's what we know from integrated information theory. Even global workspace theory that doesn't contradict this. Our minds synthesize our experiences. They bring perception together with thoughts, with beliefs, with emotions, creating a sort of an all encompassing gestalt of experience. Because that's how our minds work. If this commerce, this direct commerce of cognitive states that bypass the dashboard, that come directly through across the dissociative boundary, when that happens and we are still perceiving the world, our minds will integrate perception with these direct access to external cognitive states and will create a different gestalt. And I think that's what you were trying to allude to when you said you still see the world like anybody else sees the world, but there is a different quality to that. There's a different gestalt. It's because these more direct cognitive states are now being integrated with your perception in a non-contradictory way. So you have no cognitive dissonance, but your experience, your perceptual experience, is now enriched in a manner that you were not used to before. So there is a clear, coherent account for this.
Yeah. That's interesting. And I can testify to what you're saying from the first person perspective because these days I can drop subject object dichotomy at will most of the time, not always, but most of the time I can drop it at will and go into this non-dual mode just as easy as like slipping on a pair of slippers where um there's no difference of self and other, there are no objects, there's just the one field that's expressing its excitations. And in this mode, there's no Bernardo separate from me. There's just the one uh, communicating with itself, right? And and it's a beautiful way of experiencing. But if I reflect on it, I notice, it actually feels like there's less cognitive activity happening in the brain. Like there's less thought, there's less cognitive. I don't know if it's the default mode network, going down or like going offline or whatever, but it feels experientially like, oh, there's less cognition needed here in this non-dual mode. And so, potentially, a brain scan would confirm that there's less going on, even though the experience from the first person perspective is actually richer, as it is with
Yeah,
psychedelics.
I can share with you a story. I mean, I'm not really a spiritual teacher. I'm not even a teacher, and so I feel slightly embarrassed talking to someone like you about my my own experiences. I feel some imposter syndrome there, but I will try to overcome this prejudice and share a story with you. Um, I remember being like 9 years old, maybe 10, and having a seminal realization. Um, which is probably the beginning of the delusion and not a realization at all. But I remember clearly having the thought, oh my God, the world around me isn't me. I am here and the world is there. And that quote, understanding or misunderstanding um, was intellectually certified as a certainty, but the rest of my being was like, how can this possibly be? This is incredible, this is amazing. And I remember a physical feeling of cold go down my spine, um, and my hair's going up like when you have
Mhm,
goosebumps.
mm.
And this happened repeatedly over a period of about half a year, and then it stopped. And then it was obvious to me that I'm here, the world is there. Of course, I'm not the world. What does that matter? But during that period of 6 months, this was incredibly surprising to me that I am not the world. This is amazing, incredible, claustrophobic, horrible, but mind blowing, because my intuition, my natural intuition, was the very opposite of that. And that's how I had been experiencing the world for 9 years. Yes, there are other people. Yes, there are trees, there are cars, but they too are me. Of course, they are me. What else could they be? It's all one play in consciousness. And the split was registered by me as a very physical sensation down my spine. I never forgot that. I never forgot.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Yeah, yeah,
So
and
it
there's
was my anti-enlightenment, Christopher. That's what I'm
but
good at.
no,
Anti-enlightenment.
but that's what everyone experiences. Everyone
Yeah.
experiences something like that at about that age. They just, some notice it a lot more, or some remember it better. Others like completely forget that, and and maybe even this conversation will make them think back and they realize, oh wait, yeah, I did have a kind of moment like that. Because as you say, it's something we have to learn. This sense of separation is learned, and it's primarily learned through language. Like by the time you're 9 years old, you've been told over and over again, there's me and there's you, and there's this and that, and you've been given all these dichotomies in language, and the mind is internalizing all those dichotomies mediated through language until it makes it its reality.
Yeah.
And as you say, in the body, there's an intuitive sense that this isn't really true, but the mind overrides the body, and there's the chill running down your
Yeah.
spine as the mind is overriding the body.
It was very physical. I think that's why I remember it so well, because it was such a peculiar physical sensation that I could trigger out of my own volition. If I would stop and think, wait, have that thought, Bernardo, you are not the world. Boom, it would happen again. And it doesn't happen anymore because
Yeah.
whatever changed now changed for good. But it leaves intellectual vestiges in the form of arbitrary boundaries that we draw, and we don't even know why we draw. For instance, um, when we are experiencing a series of thoughts, one thought here, and then a little bit later another thought, and then another thought, it's like going down a lane of thoughts. But
Mhm.
we experience those thoughts as our own, as an expression of our own being. But when we go down a lane of houses, it's also an experience. First you see one house, then you see the next house, and then the next house. It's also an experience. It's also happening in your mind. But now we say, no, 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 that is outside. The thoughts
Mm.
are in here. The lane of thoughts are in here. The lane of houses is outside. This is completely arbitrary. Both
Yes.
are a series of sequential experiences.
Exactly, exactly. So two points on this. One, just to note, I'm sure you've heard this, but it's really true that when this conditioning of inside, outside, self, other, or self world is starts to be undone in the so-called enlightenment process or awakening process, many people, including myself, experience a current running up the spine.
Oh, yeah, I
And
heard that somebody told Kundalini.
yes, it can be called Kundalini. But yeah, it's so curious that you had that experience because the current running up the spine is very much associated with undoing that very conditioning that gets put in place.
Y-
And but of course, the conditioning can be deconstructed without that somatic experience, but it is a very common experience. But also, I want to turn to this interesting issue of the difference between what we habitually call internal phenomena, uh, thoughts and feelings, and external phenomena. Because the way that the tradition I study articulates it is it's purely an issue of vantage point, meaning to say, just as right now, this physical body can see things that you can't see and vice versa, right? We have different vantage points, even not just because we're on computers. If we're in the same physical space, we also have different vantage points. We're seeing different things, right? And so the fact that I can see my thoughts, the thoughts I habitually call mine, and not yours, is likewise just an issue of vantage point. um, to use your whirlpool metaphor, it's like the thoughts and feelings are deeper down in the whirlpool, so they're immediately obvious from this vantage point. But your thoughts and feelings deeper down in this other whirlpool are hard to perceive. Not impossible, in fact, but quite difficult. Now, would you agree that with this formulation that we could describe this as purely an issue of a vantage point, or do you think there's some actual ontological distinction to be drawn between what people habitually call mental phenomena versus other sorts, physical phenomena?
You need a dissociative boundary for there to be perception. Otherwise, you would be your experiences. You wouldn't perceive them. They wouldn't have the qualities of color, melody, flavor. You would have the direct quality of being in that mental state. So you could say there is something ontological that gives rise to perception, um, but it's not fundamental. There is no fundamental separation between the in here and the out there. This separation is epiphenomenal. In other words, it's emergent. It's a kind of illusion that is a symptom of a certain configuration of mind. It's not a fundamental boundary in mind. Um, Another thing to take into account is that although we have the qualities of perception. We perceive color, we perceive melody, we perceive saltiness, we perceive texture. Um, when we say that we are perceiving the world, we are experiencing always more than that. We never experience raw perception because we are interpretative cognitive systems together with the perception mixed into the same gestalt or the same complex, to use the words of integrated information theory. Um, the narratives that tell us what it is that we are perceiving, they get merged with the perception itself. So you are never exposed to the raw qualities of perception. Those are always mixed in with interpretation, with the stories you tell yourself about what it is that you are perceiving. And if part of that story is that tree is out there, then you will actually perceive the tree out there. Because without this interpretation that gets sort of mixed in, there would be no tree. There would be just a tapestry of pixels. There would be no boundaries between objects. There would be just a tapestry of pixels. That's all there would be, a tapestry of colors. But we don't see that. We see objects. So that's already language sort of seeping into perception and nominally enforcing boundaries between pixels, boundaries that are not out there, they are in here. When we see a car, we are imposing a boundary between the car and the road. When we see a table with its four legs, we are imposing those boundaries in a tapestry of brown pixels and pixels of many tones and many colors. So that's the thing. Even if there isn't anything ontological about perception, there may be, but okay, even if there is something ontological about perception, um, our experience is, for the vast majority, I think, um, determined by the narratives that we conflate with perception in a very natural way. It's not dysfunctional. Evolution has made us do that. It is functional for surviving. It is just not functional for philosophy. It's not functional for getting closer to what is really going on, for living a healthy life, living or having a healthy psychological outlook. It is functional for finding a mate, finding food, and running away from the tiger. So you need to say, there is a tiger. It's not just pixels, and that tiger can kill me. I better run away. So it is functional for survival. But our society has transcended the mere survival already a long time ago. As far as mere survival is concerned, we should die at around 35 when we have grandkids, and certainly before 50 when we are just overloading the tribe as physically less apt members that still require feeding and shelter. Um, so because we live so long, we've transcended all the challenges for which we have evolved. We have a body that has evolved for the challenges of the Neolithic or earlier, or to speak popular language, for the challenges of the caveman. That's the body we have. It evolved for that. And in that body is the dashboard representation of a cognitive system. So that cognitive system has taken on this configuration for the challenges of caveman in the Neolithic, maybe in the Paleolithic, um, before even more sophisticated tools. And we have that same cognitive system right now, but now we live to 82. And the challenges are no longer not always and only how I put food on the table tomorrow and how I make sure there is a roof over my head, but what is the meaning of my life? How am I supposed to engage with the world? How can I put myself in tune with the subtle but overwhelming understreams of the natural mind? These are new challenges for which we haven't evolved.
Yeah, 2 points on this. One, maybe a little disagreement, maybe not. It is possible to experience a perception in this extremely raw manner. I've had that experience many times, whereby, yeah, there there are no objects, there is no tree per se, because there's just the wash of the visual field, and there's just the sensations, and it's all happening, and it's very raw. It seems to me that metacognition and narrative, right? They're so tightly bound together. You can't have one without the other. So in this state I'm talking about of raw perception, where there's no narrative, there's also very little metacognition. So if somebody puts something, if I'm in that state and somebody puts something salty in my mouth, the experience of the saltiness is, if anything, more pronounced, more vivid, but no, there's no mental thing happening of like, oh, that's salty. It's not salty because it's not an interpretation, but it's hard to describe in words, of course, because words are not made for this. But there's that visceral experience that later I'll call saltiness, but without the labeling. um it's a state that, if you're really in it, of course, to somebody else, you're going to appear to be um, non-functional, or a dribbling idiot, or more like another animal, a non-human animal, but it's also a state that can be infused with tremendous wonder, and the metacognitive faculty comes back online, and then you can talk about it, and you can even sort of start to integrate it with your everyday consciousness, in which you're seeing objects, but you don't take it very seriously. The nominal parsing of the world is experienced, but it's not taken as seriously because of the impact of that non-dual mode.
I believe you. Statistically, this is uncommon. Um, I surely believe you. I think this should, in principle, be possible. And if when you reported that to me, I believe you 100%, with a pinch of envy, because I cannot will myself into that state. I am very hard headed.
Yes, but I think it can't fail to become your experience sooner or later, to be honest, because well, I believe Abhinavagupta on this, who's one of my gurus from 1,000 years ago, and he says, and it feels intuitively right to me, that if you keep cultivating your mental understanding of these truths, that eventually it's going to show up experientially more and more. And for most people, that happens as the physical body gets closer to death, that mental understanding is going to manifest more and more and more experientially. That's what I would predict
Yeah,
for.
yeah. You're the second person to say this to me. The first one was Rupert Spira, who is a personal friend. And there was a time we were talking about it. I even remember the day we were in an Italian restaurant, and I was mildly frustratedly telling him that I understand things conceptually, but my understanding doesn't modulate my emotional life. It's like it stays here in the canopy and doesn't sink into the trunk and the roots. And that was frustrating because I was experiencing a lot of anxiety at the time. And he looked at me in the eye and said, "It will come. It will happen by itself. It's unavoidable."
Mhm,
And that was years ago. And sure enough, it did begin to happen, not to the level we are talking about here. But what has happened to me was two things that are very significant, that surprisingly happened to me. And I didn't even noticing it happening. One day I looked back and I realized, oh my God, this has happened. This has changed. One was the notion that my life is about me, Bernardo Kastrup,
mm,
that faded away. Um, so everything that is individually important for Bernardo Kastrup ceased to be significant. That was a relief. The other one is the opposite. I'm very uncomfortable with it. The distinction between me and another person or animal is vaguer. It's more vague now,
mm.
and that opens me up to a degree of suffering I didn't know existed. And because I was not like that, I didn't evolve any coping mechanism psychologically when I was younger. And this sort of came to, you know, grab me at a point in life where I had no defenses. I was not armed against it, and only now I am evolving strategies. Like I will always enter the room of empathy in the palace of my mind because my humanity depends on it, but I don't want to live there all the time because it makes
Mm.
me dysfunctional. So this
Yeah.
second thing, um, yeah, I'm not sure this was a good. It's certainly good for my humanity. It's not necessarily good for my ability to function in life. But I have never been able to avoid carving out artificial boundaries between objects. I've never been able to will away this semantic linguistic parsing of the world into different objects. That I have never. It didn't happen yet. Maybe one day when I'm older.
And I don't think you should try to eliminate that. But what can happen, it happens in a sort of through the back door, where it may happen spontaneously all at once, that you sense what you are in what you're seeing or tasting or hearing. And there's no better way to describe this very ineffable experience, but you suddenly sense what you are in what is perceived, and then it can spread, and you're sensing what you are in all the phenomena, and that's when the nominal boundaries dissolve or cease to impose themselves in the same way. So,
And
and
when that happens, does it increase empathy even more?
it can, yes, but not in the way that you're describing necessarily, because like you're more open now to other people's suffering and to the suffering of the world, and that's painful when you're still experiencing suffering as something intrinsically bad, and which I think is a good. It's good to experience suffering as intrinsically bad on the level of the organism that needs to survive, that wants to survive. But there's this sort of deeper level of experience which somehow is non-contradictory, where the suffering is now like um, part of a piece of music. A piece of music that moves you. It has passages that are profoundly sad, we would say, but they're part of the beauty of that piece of music. You wouldn't edit out the sad passages. It would
I,
make it less beautiful.
I understand this. I wrote almost exactly this a few weeks ago. But this only works for me in the mirror of memory. So when the
Mm,
suffering is behind me, then yes, I can understand that it's one of the colors of the palette that has painted my life and everybody else's life, and that without it would be a lesser work of art. I understand that, but only when it's in the past. When it's in the present, I do not have the ability to contemplate it from those heights. I sink right into the thick of it, into the wailing layers of despair and sorrow.
yeah.
Um,
and and instead of trying to elevate it, right, because this is the thing, we can't come at any of this from a kind of should perspective, like oh, I should experience it in this more elevated way, let me try. That doesn't work, right? But what does work is these other approaches, sort of each time through a back door that was not suspected, but it's discovered. Like, for example, um, if you're in the depths of despair and someone else is in the depths of despair, and you're able to open and experience that together as a form of connection, then in that moment you can sense the beauty of that experience of suffering, right? And so oftentimes we need to be sharing it to get the feeling of the beauty of it in the moment rather than in retrospect, as you said. And that requires more openness.
And that's counterintuitive because you feel like, oh, I'm suffering enough from being open, I should close down. But sometimes more openness can help us access the beauty of the pain.
Yeah, I hear you.
Let me turn to one more thing, because as far as I can tell, everything, uh, almost every insight about the nature of reality can be realized through this cognitive process of contemplation that you've gone through, where you're willing to question every assumption, and you're willing to think things through so carefully that you just end up with that which makes the most sense in light of our experience when we're free of assumptions. And uh, I think your view of reality can be almost complete in this purely analytical route. But I would propose that there's maybe one thing that gets missed through that route that has to be discovered in another way, and that's where spirituality comes in. And so let me just read a couple sentences here from my book Tantra Illuminated. Um, and I think you'll identify quite easily the word that I have in mind here. Okay, so just three or four sentences here. All that exists throughout all time and beyond is one infinite consciousness, free and blissful, which projects within the field of its awareness a vast multiplicity of apparently differentiated subjects and objects, where each object, quote unquote, is an actualization of a timeless potentiality inherent in the light of consciousness, and each subject is also that, plus is a contracted locus of self-awareness. This creation is a play insofar as it has no reason for being other than itself. And it is the result of the natural impulse within consciousness to express the totality of its self-knowledge in action, an impulse arising from love. The unbounded light of consciousness contracts into finite embodied loci of awareness out of its own free will. So a few sentences there, and of course the word I had in mind was love, that it's the part that can't be rationally inferred, and doesn't make any sense really, like but it's discovered in this spiritual awakening process, that every movement of the will that causes experience to be, because every experience is just arising due to a movement of the will, of the one overarching will, that it's motivated by, in a way, by love. But the problem, of course, is that the word love has the wrong connotations, but we don't have a better word for this, because it's not like object-oriented love, because there is no object yet. It's a precognitive movement. It's something like love when the heart sort of bursts open and moves towards the world, moves towards embracing everything. That's when we're getting a sense of this love that I'm alluding to there in that passage, and that it's possible to experience that every movement is motivated by something like love. And it would seem to me to be that this is the only part of the total equation of reality that's not discoverable through this process of rational inference. And yet, as I mentioned a little bit the other day, I sense even like you're someone who's, maybe could easily be considered a hyper rationalist,
Yeah.
and yet the project you have of articulating this view so well and so beautifully in 9 or 10 books now, um, that at the core of it there is love, even if that's not explicitly acknowledged. Just like it's there's something like love at the core of everything, even though it's not love in that ordinary human sense.
I I I can't know the degree to which this is true for sure, but I am cognizant, Christopher, of my cognitive limitations. I am fairly cognizant, I think, that the royal avenue to knowledge is introspection. It's not rationalization. It's not empirical evidence. It is introspection. That's how you cut down the layers of delusion and you get to the noumenon, to the core of being, to what is really going on. It is for a number of reasons that I have collected throughout my life. It's clear to me that this is true. Um, and of course, by saying this, you're stimulating me to get there, to complement, the produce of rational inquiry and empirical evidence with a much deeper and more nuanced perspective on what's going on. And then I agree, and I think you're absolutely right. Um, how do I say what I want to say now without misleading you and your audience? Okay, who I really am is a kid who wants to build computers. That's the sum total. That, that's Bernardo Kastrup. Well, it's not who I really am, of course. I am the subjectivity of nature, just like you are. But insofar as the delusion goes, the way I feel as an individual is I just want to build computers and have fun. I'm just a kid who wants to build computers and have fun.
Which
That's,
which is not a delusion, by the way. It is just that's the feature of the individuality, the individual whirlpool cone that's real. I think that's perfectly real. It's just individual.
yeah. Um, so I never planned that I would become a publisher, a philosopher that people would look up to for wisdom. Sometimes I look in the mirror and I'm like, how did this ever happen? This is one of those things that life does with you that you don't see coming, and you can only have a laugh, you can only giggle at this because the irony of the thing is delightfully funny, in a way. When I started thinking about these deeper questions, it's because I realized that my own account of reality uh, had no legs,
Hmm.
um, and I felt a vacuum. It's like, Mom, I need a story in terms of which I can relate to the world and live my life. Otherwise, you feel like there is a hole in your chest. It's like you're stepping on eggs. You need some foundation narrative that, even though it may not be ultimately true, at least it stands up to scrutiny at the current stage of our intellectual development. So that's what I was after. And when I wrote down my conclusions, which became my first book, I wrote them for myself because I was afraid I would forget certain key links in the story. And because that story was not in the culture, at least in the part of the culture I could access, the libraries I was given, the references I was given, it was nowhere to be found there. I thought, no, I better write it down and record this because I need this as a guide for myself. And after it was done, then that seminal thought came, this may be valuable for other people too. If it's valuable to you, maybe it helps other people too. So maybe you should look into publishing. And then the whole thing took on a life of its own. Um, and it doesn't feel like it is something I did. It's like um, nature wanted to do that, and I happened to be at the right place at the right time, and I was convenient. I had the words, I had a bibliography, and the boy would do. So we used him. That's the notion the fantasy I have in my mind. So it was never my goal, Christopher, to become a wise person and be enlightened. And I'm saying this to you so you understand um, how things are working here within my own dissociated outer. Um, Now that I am intellectually at peace with the narrative I have, and I have people like you who resonate with it and give me a reassurance, like, oh, Bernardo, uh, what you're saying has been said for thousands of years, and it's in that book that's a thousands of years old. That reassures me, and it almost gives me the feeling I don't need to be enlightened then. It's okay. Now I can go build computers. Know what I mean?
Yes, yes, and that's true. That's the thing. Any should, like I should be enlightened or this or that, it's just a mental construct, you know? So there's no should here anywhere to be found in reality. So there's no need for anything to be different from how it is. And yet there's a natural process. You know, I can relate to everything you just said. And I think if we're honest, we all have that aspect of ourselves, just the kid who wants to play in one way or another. That's what makes the individuality. But you play that way, I play this way. Um, and then there's what life wants to do through us when we open ourselves up to
Yeah.
to a wider possibility. And so I have the same experience of like my career. It's not my career. It's just what life wanted to do. And I didn't have enough illusion of personal will to try to do anything else, you know. Um, so yeah,
And since
similar.
that notion that my life is about me, since that notion dropped, it's very hard to muster um, motivation to achieve something.
Right.
If you know what I mean.
Right.
I have motivation to be of service. That I have. It's what has remained after my self-importance fell away. Um, the idea of being of service to whatever is going on, that is very present, and I feel it very intuitively. I know every day when I wake up in the morning what it is that I need to do to be of service. It just comes to me. But
Yeah.
time then remains to play with computers.
Yeah.
and,
Yeah.
and this very image, when I picture myself, I will be an enlightened, wise man. I, I can't hold that seriously. It's impossible to take it seriously for me. I
Yeah.
don't. My self image does not fit with that. If you know what I mean.
Yeah. And it doesn't need to, right? That image of the enlightened wise man, it's just a mental image. And it's perfectly possible that you experience less and less of a boundary, and that is to say the dissociative boundary gets more and more porous naturally over time as you do what life wants to do through you, which looks like accomplishment from the outside as you publish more
Yeah,
books
indeed. Yeah.
and play with computers. No activity can impede that dissociative boundary becoming more and more porous if that's what's ready to happen. So and no image of the process is really needed because it's an organic process.
Yeah.
um
If I fail to write a book I need to write, I feel very bad.
hmm,
I feel guilty. I feel like I'm not doing what I'm supposed to do. I'm not being of service. But when I finally write it, it doesn't give me a sense of enormous happiness and contentment. It just gives me relief. But when
yeah.
like last year, I designed for fun a video games console. And then last year, a company decided, we want to commercialize this. And then the thing was commercialized. And I got the serial number 1. It's called Agon Console 8. Um, then I was really happy.
Yeah, yeah.
And from the outside, the guy designed a video games console. So what? But the guy wrote a nice book. from the outside, it looks like the achievement equation is the opposite of what it feels from the inside, which is funny. It's amazing how life can be um,
Yes.
um,
Yes.
a
But of course,
little.
we derive meaning not just from happiness, but also from that sense you're talking about of like, this needed to happen through me. This book needed to get written, and now it is written. And there's a satisfaction in that sense of rightness, even if it doesn't generate,
There's
positive
relief.
affect in the same way.
There's relief.
Yeah.
If I don't do it, if I resist it, I can become literally sick.
Yeah.
So it's not an energy that is seducing me from the front. It's an energy that is kicking me on the butt from behind. You see what I mean?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. And once many listeners are going to relate to this, once you start putting yourself in service of what life wants to do through you, if then you try to resist, it can make you feel sick.
Yeah,
It's
yeah. I've
really true.
oh, do I know about that, sir? That part I am very thoroughly acquainted with. Yeah, over 15 years of having to learn how to deal with this. Yeah.
Yes. So surrender. I highly recommend surrender to the natural flow to avoid that.
I, some people ask me, so how did you surrender? Um, and the answer is, I didn't. I was broken.
Yeah.
It's not like I
Checkmated.
decided, okay, now it's enough. I will surrender. No, the thing just broke me. I was broken. I was, I don't even know whether it's of any value to describe the specifics. But I was at I was at a point where I thought, does it even make sense to continue to live?
Yeah.
And when that breaks you, then I think the result is similar to what you described as surrender, because there is no fight left in you. It's not like you decide to surrender and you're saving your energies for later. No, there's nothing left there to fight. You're through. And
It's
then
true.
it's a great relief. Then it's
Yeah.
wonderful. Then life becomes so much lighter. It's like you dropped 100 kilos of ballast over your shoulders. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's the thing of people hear about this and they say, "Well, that doesn't sound good." And in the moment of being broken, it doesn't feel good. But then in the aftermath of it, it's like you're giving yourself into the arms of
Yeah.
life, and that is a wonderful
Yeah.
feeling.
It's the only thing that deserves the word freedom.
Yeah.
Nothing else compares to that in terms of freedom. It's the freedom of service, it's the freedom of the slave. You are in chains and you are no longer fighting it. It's oh man, that's it's one of the most wonderful um, inner feelings that one can
And
have.
it's
Yeah.
exactly, and it's connected to the realization, whether the realization happens on the cognitive level or not, it's the realization of the illusory nature of the separate self and its personal will. Because as you describe in your books, it's like using the membrane metaphor, or the multidimensional membrane. There's these vibrations moving through the one whole interconnected field of being, and the protrusions that we call individuals, right, receive those vibrations, and there might be vibrations happening uniquely in a given protrusion of the membrane, but they're inseparable from the vibrations moving through the whole field. And what we experience as things like desire and inspiration and also even resistance, it's all part of that complex array of vibrations. And the resistance naturally starts to dissolve when we realize, oh, I'm not a source of vibration in any significant way because all the vibrations that originate here are in response to a wider set of vibrations. And so it's just like surrendering to the reality, because why would you not why would you not accept
Yeah.
reality?
Looking back, the realization I had is the amount of energy that it takes, emotional, psychic energy, and experiential energy, the amount of energy that needs to be mobilized to maintain the status and the sense of self-worth of the individual self is monstrous. It's massive,
Yep.
and we don't feel it because it's routine. We are always mobilizing all that energy to maintain our sense of individual self-worth and status. And once you're no longer trying to do that, only then you realize, my God, how much energy was
Yep.
going into that maintenance process, that precarious maintenance process. The thing is always breaking apart and you're gluing it back together every day. And that's most of what you're doing every day. And then
Exactly.
when you give yourself the freedom, I don't need to do that anymore because you're broken now. It's amazing. It's like opening the window in a room that has been closed for 20 years and taking a breath of fresh air for the first time.
See, this is the interesting thing. Here, I'm hearing you have more and more of the realizations that people call spiritual realizations,
Yeah,
but it's a natural effect of the process that started as a purely intellectual one.
maybe life teaches
Yeah, yeah,
by breaking you.
yeah. Um, so let's tie up a couple of loose ends here before we finish. Obviously, you have a bunch of books. Two questions: where should people start? What would be the first book they should read? And are there earlier books that you now feel are not adequate, that or have something in there that you've now changed your mind about?
Not really. Maybe there were formulations that later on I thought I could have formulated that better, but then I did it. My publisher allowed me to review all my books. That was
Mm,
back in 2017, I think. And since then, I have maintained consistency in how I use words and the avenues I take to explore a problem. So
mm,
now all the 11 books are very mutually consistent, and I'm happy with all of them.
mm,
Um, the only thing that it stays in my mind is if you read my very earliest books, like Rational Spirituality and then Dreamed Up Reality and then Meaning in Absurdity, you see that I oscillate between granting significant reality to an external world that doesn't depend on our perception of it. It's just that we don't have direct access to it. What we perceive is a cognitive representation that we make. It's our own dashboard. But the world that is modulating that dashboard representation from the outside really exists and it's objective. I oscillate between this and a more constructivist notion in which we play a much more active role in making up what we call the external world, that it depends more on us than we think. Now, this may sound like two poles, but they are mutually consistent because of what I mentioned before. I think there is a real external world that doesn't depend on us, but we cannot access it directly. What we experience is an amalgamation of us and the world, us as measurement instrument, and the world as the thing measured. And the result of that as part of both of us. And what you see across different books is that sometimes I emphasize one side of this equation and sometimes I emphasize the other. Has to do with audience as well, with traditional scholarly audiences, in other words, scientists and philosophers in the West, the analytic tradition. I emphasize the acceptance of an external world while saying that, but we never see it. All we have is a dashboard. We don't have a transparent window to see it. And with the more open-minded, spiritually oriented crowd, I may be more comfortable in highlighting the tremendous role that our own cognition plays into giving rise to what we experience as the external world, which is in fact at least largely internal, just modulated by something outside. So that oscillation you see in different books, I sort of emphasize more different things. And as for where to start from, there's a free way to start. If you go to my website, bernardokastrup.com, and then there are running slides and on top of the website One of those slides is a link to a course on analytic idealism, over 6 hours of material on YouTube, which is free for everybody, no registration, nothing. You just watch the YouTube video. If you're in doubt whether it's worth pursuing what I have to say by purchasing a book or not, maybe you can have a look at that course. It's for free. But if you really go for a book, it depends on your dispositions. If you have a moderately rational disposition, but you're not all uptight on that, uptight on rigorous words, and if you're not uptight but you have a rational disposition, I would start with the book that's coming out this year, Analytic Idealism in a nutshell.
Mm-hmm.
It is pure rationality and evidence, but it doesn't use jargon. It illustrates examples with metaphors. So it's very accessible and tends to a rational disposition. If you're very uptight and you want rigor, then I would say The Idea of the World, which is a collection of peer-reviewed academic papers. And if you're more open-minded and you have a more mythical disposition, you're more into metaphorical and symbolic stories and analogies, then I would go for more than allegory.
Great. Yeah, and I just want to say a couple things in response to what you said. A little ways back, this insight you had that your life is not about you. I remember when I first heard you say that in one of your videos, because YouTube will show me, hey, watch this video, and I was like, oh, this is wonderful, because it's great to see that growth process in our public intellectuals, right? But also I loved how unabashedly counterintuitive it is relative to our mainstream culture, right? If you say to someone in our mainstream culture, well, your life is not about you, nothing could be more counterintuitive to them.
Yeah.
And oftentimes those counterintuitive encapsulations of realization, they have the most power. We go into, what is that? What is that referring to? What can I discover there? So I really appreciate that. But that's just a brief mention. I wanna just come to something you said there about the nature of reality and how much we contribute to it. So there's this formulation, and I said we're wrapping up now, but before we wrap up, let me just hit this because it's interesting and I forgot to mention it. There's this formulation in the tradition I study that kind of goes like this. It's quasi metaphorical, but it's also quasi literal. That each sentient being has a singularity called a bindu point, uh, a singularity which is the source. um, it's kind of described to use physics terminology, because the Sanskrit is more difficult to parse. The singularity in each sentient being is almost like a wormhole or a white hole through which content spills into the universe of experience from the absolute ground of being. So this notion that in some places in the tradition, not everywhere, that sentient beings are spilling content into the universe of experience through the singularity point, which is the core or center of what they are, even though it's not literally a center, it's non-local. And and so all the singularities of all sentient beings are also entangled, right? They ultimately have one source, so they're not separable. Um, and according, and this is something the tradition never quite perfectly pins down, but according to one view, um, all content, all phenomena that exists, it's all generated through the all the sentient beings. That is to say, each sentient being, you can think of it as having a sphere of experience, and then we have a 3D Venn diagram where all the spheres of experience are overlapping in complex ways, but none of them perfectly overlap because you have private experience. but they all overlap because there's shared experience. But at the center of each sphere of experience is that singularity that's generating the content, and that according to one view, there's nothing to reality apart from what what is being spilled forth into experience from the singularity of all the sentient beings combined, which ultimately has one source, the called the Mahabindu in Sanskrit. Um, or there's another view, which is that some content comes from mind at large, comes from Shiva, or God, um, not through the singularity of any embodied sentient being. Um, and so it's this is like the spiritual or theological way of talking about maybe the distinction that you were making, and perhaps it's not possible for us to actually know which is true. um, is it that the totality of existence is just the sum of all experiences had by all conscious creatures, or there's something more? And but if there was, how could that more be anything other than speculative from our point of view? Maybe death is what resolves that contradiction.
Yeah,
Any thoughts on that?
notice how open I leave the nature of this external world. I'm not saying what it is. I'm just saying there are external states. So what you alluded to when you said all these spheres are entangled, they come from the same source, such that their respectively created experiences are mutually consistent. They are not disjoint from one another. Whatever takes care of this mutual consistency could be the external world. The external world doesn't need, and it's certainly not a world in 3D space and one dimensional time. It's not contents in an empty box. It's just whatever mechanism there must be to ensure that our mutually created experiences are consistent with one another. So even if we are projecting all of this around us, and the world we perceive is entirely made up by us, there is something underlying all of us that ensures that these projections are mutually consistent. That would still qualify as an external world because it's an external influence.
Yeah, yeah. And in this tradition, instead of calling it an external world, they just call it God, right? That there's something that coheres
Yeah,
everything. That the very coherence, and we have these exact passages, in fact, where they say, "Oh, by God, we don't mean a superhuman being. We
yeah,
mean that which coheres all of this,
yeah.
and
That
nothing more."
I'm perfectly comfortable with this.
Yeah, interesting. So, and the last loose end, maybe the last, you mentioned at least one dissociative boundary. What would be an example of there being more than one dissociative boundary?
Uh, when I experience your sadness, that goes across my own dissociative boundary and across yours. So, across yours, your sadness could express itself in appearance as you're crying. But your crying is not directly accessible to my inner states. I need to perceive your crying through my own dissociative boundary. So, your inner states are observable by me only across two dissociative boundaries.
Hmm. Right, and that's why empathy is more difficult for some humans.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah, on that
interesting.
account, it's more difficult. On another account, the account of similarity, it's easier because it's easier to empathize to someone who is like you than it is to empathize with something that is totally unlike you. Um,
Ah.
maybe these things balance out. I don't know.
It may turn out that what we call a psychopath is literally just a human who cannot perceive across two dissociative boundaries through
Yeah,
no fault of
clinically,
their
a
own.
psychopath is one who does not have the capacity for empathy. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
that's correct.
Interesting. Okay, and then lastly, on the subject of evolution, you invoked a couple times, and I love evolutionary biology and that field, but from a kind of more absolute point of view, we would say that evolution is just an effective story that we tell about the pattern we observe in experience. Like when we look deeply into the nature of experience, it has features that are most efficiently explained by the story of evolution, and that from an absolute point of view, we can't reify the narratives. We can't say, well, this is what happened in these billions of years. We can only say that it appears that that's the most effective story to tell, to make sense of all the experiences we're having now,
Yeah,
and that we can leave it open, like so that a lot of people don't understand in this era of black and white thinking that the negation of one idea does not constitute the affirmation of its opposite. And
correct.
so it's just to say that we have to be careful about reifying our stories too much, right? And that if we do reify the story of evolution or any other story, it would seem to lend credence to the physicalist view, but we needn't reify it to that extent. We can just say, oh, it's a way of explaining the patterns we see in experience. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, look, endorsing evolution is by no means an endorsement of physicalism. It doesn't, evolution does not entail or imply physicalism. Um, Physicalism is a metaphysics, not a scientific theory. It's not about how nature behaves, it's about what nature is supposed to be. So any metaphysics that is coherent will still be compatible with evolution. You just interpret the nature of the things that evolve in a different way. Under physicalism, what evolves are non-conscious structures that at some point in the journey of complexity give rise to consciousness. Under idealism, what evolves are alters, dissociated complexes of the mind of nature. And over time, these alters become more sophisticated in their internal cognitive mechanisms. Consciousness is never given birth to. Consciousness is the space where evolution is happening. It's an a priori, it's not something that evolution creates. Now, you're correct that evolution is a convenient fiction. And so, why don't I make that disclaimer? I don't, because the same thing can be said about all scientific theories. All scientific theories are convenient fictions. This is mainstream philosophy of science. Only philosophically ignorant scientists who actually don't do science, they only talk about science on radio and television, only they don't know that. Everybody
Mhm.
laboring to do real science understands that all scientific theories, all theoretical entities are models. They are descriptions. They are not what is. They are convenient fictions in terms of which we can predict what will happen next. Nature behaves as though the convenient fictions were true. And that's enough for us to predict the future states of nature and put a man on the moon or develop mobile phones. None of this requires that the convenient fictions be actually true. And historically, they have never been. When Newton came up with the convenient fiction of this invisible force that acted instantaneously at a distance to make the apple fall to the ground, and he called it gravity, it took the French 50 years to stop laughing of it. Because obviously, there are no invisible forces that act at a distance without contact. And then we adopted that convenient fiction because it was very convenient. It could predict the orbits of the planets, with
Mm.
one exception, Mercury. And then Einstein came up and said, there is no such invisible force. Things fall or things are attracted to one another, not because they are pulled by a force, but because the very fabric of space time bends and twists, the invisible fabric of space time. And that became our new convenient fiction because Mercury behaved as though that were true, and the
Mhm.
trajectory of Mercury could be predicted in those terms. Today, we abandon that convenient fiction. Loop quantum gravity abandons the fabric of space-time as a fundamental or primitive existence. Now, time is a epiphenomenon of microscopic structures, quantum level processes. That's the new convenient fiction. So I don't qualify my use of evolution, because if I were to do that, I would have to qualify my use of all science. Now, that doesn't mean that these convenient fictions are not useful, that they don't have something to contribute. They do provide insight into the nature of nature, because nature behaves as though they were true up to a certain point. So I think it's fair to use evolution in an account of metacognition, because data supports that. That said, I don't take it literally, Christopher, because I know better than to think of time as fundamental. Well, there is one physicist who I respect very much, Lee Smolin, who still thinks time is fundamental at the price of making all space non-fundamental. There is no space. Others do the opposite. They say there is no time, there is only space. People like Julian Barbour, who is a friend of Lee Smolin. I think neither time or space are fundamental. I think they're both cognitive constructs. They are the dimensions of the dashboard, the axes in which the dials move. They don't exist outside the cockpit. They don't exist in the world as it is in itself. And the moment I say that, I have a problem. I run into a problem with evolution, because evolution is something that's supposed to play in time. If there is no time, then there is no evolution. And that's correct. But I still think it's useful to do that for the following reason. There is something outside time that, when projected onto time, can be described as evolution. In other words, evolution is not ultimately true, but it is penultimately true. It is a projection of something that is true. Our intellect cannot capture the real thing outside time, because we think in terms of space-time. So the best we have is the projection. It's the shadow. The shadow betrays the presence of a real truth, even though it's not the direct manifestation of that truth. It's a projection of it. It's an error to take the shadow for the thing that projects the shadow, but it is also an error to dismiss the shadow as completely unimportant, because it does provide information about the thing that casts that shadow. And it is in this sense, and this sense alone, that I do use evolution in my arguments.
Totally agree with everything you said, um, except a tiny thing, which is that evolution I would regard as different from other scientific theories, not in principle, but in the fact that in the minds of most people, it's more tightly tied to physicalism than
That's an
than
error.
than it is an error. It is an error, but in our for our listeners,
Yeah,
evolution can be more tightly tied to physicalism and to embrace, and of course, like who could ever understand the scientific method and not embrace evolutionary theory through and natural selection and evolutionary biology. If you understand the scientific method at all, of course you embrace it, because it's one of the most well validated conclusions of the scientific method, right? But
yeah.
but yeah, and just in the minds of many people, it gets closely tied to pure physicalism, and it's wrong, as you
Yeah,
said.
but I don't want to concede that, because that's a strategy physicalists use. They claim that physicalism has been the enabler of all key scientific discoveries. That's a fallacy.
Right.
Science is the study of what nature does, how nature behaves, because a good scientific theory is that which predicts what nature would do next. Science has nothing to say about what nature is. That's an issue of metaphysics. Physicalism is a metaphysics. It's the pronouncement that whatever nature is, it's not fundamentally mental, fundamentally experiential, fundamentally conscious. All of science stays unaffected if we switch from physicalism to idealism, because nature, if it is mental, will still be doing what we know it does, and we will still be able to predict what it will do next, just as we have been in the past. Physicalism gets no brownie points for the success of science and technology, but physicalists pretend that it does, which is a fallacy, and I don't want to concede that, because it's their way to rob me of the tools I need to make my argument. I use science as a tool. So if I concede the tools to them and refuse to use those tools myself, that will be a gratuitous concession, not based in truth or reason or evidence at all. So I refuse to make that concession. I will still be using evolutionary theory as part of
Great.
my arsenal.
No, absolutely. I totally support that. And I didn't mean to imply otherwise. I guess I just meant to imply that evolution, perhaps more than other scientific theories, there might need to be a caveat when discussing it. Oh, by this I don't mean to suggest that physicalism is
Yeah.
true, but
This changes. I understand there is this prejudice in the popular mind, this popular misconception. But the only way it will change is when people who are overtly not physicalists are talking about evolution in the same tone and manner that the physicalists talk about it. If we
yeah,
can normalize this in the media, then this prejudice will vanish. This
yeah,
misconception will vanish.
yeah. And this is absolutely key what you're saying here, because I've heard a couple of interviews you did with people who didn't understand your view, and they kept not understanding it for like 2 hours, and the reason is because the unexamined assumptions are still not being examined, and that's the thing, is like what you said a moment ago. It's like we can understand science as a mapping of the patterns of mind at large, or the patterns of the movements of energy within mind at large, and nothing changes.
Exactly.
So that yeah, that and that's very, very key. Like in my latest book, I embrace some science, and some people are like, "I thought you were, a non-dual spiritual." It's like, wait, there's no contradiction here at
Yeah,
all.
none at all. The idealist sun will still rise in the morning, guaranteed.
Yeah, the contradiction, in fact, is between old world Western monotheistic religion and science.
Exactly.
Yeah,
Exactly. But it is a part of the rhetoric of physicalists to frame the debate. Instead of physicalism versus idealism, they frame it as science versus religion or rationality versus faith. By framing the debate that way, they guarantee that they will win because they dressed the opposition in the clothes of something that can't really sustain itself. They create a straw man. That's a
yeah,
technical term in philosophy. You misrepresent the position of your opponent, and then you proceed to demonstrate that it's untenable. Yeah, your misrepresentation is untenable, not what your opponent is actually saying. So this is
yeah,
a rhetoric, a rhetorical technique that is far and widely used by physicalists, and it
yeah.
is fallacious.
And you've refuted it well. This is one of your great acts of service, is that far from like believing idealism being some kind of woo woo thing, you've shown that it is, in fact, the most parsimonious conclusion. That is the conclusion that requires the least unwarranted or unfounded assumptions.
Yeah, and it is perfectly coherent.
Yeah. Well, thank you for your generous time and work and
My
offerings
pleasure.
to the world, and thank you for speaking to the spiritual audience as well as the scientific audience. And in fact, maybe that's one of your greatest acts of service, is to effectively bridge those worlds. And it really is a wonderful contribution, and I hope that you know that contribution completes itself in time for you to do more just playing with computers.
Thank you, Christopher, and thanks for your help in this dialogue. It's been personally useful to me as well.
Wonderful. Okay, until next time, be
See you next
well.
time.
Afterword. For those not already familiar with Bernardo's work, the foregoing conversation might seem a little inscrutable at times. I'm not always good at imagining what it's like to be new to these ideas. And Bernardo has been talking about them almost nonstop for the past 10 years or more. So I think he also sometimes forgets how high the bar to entry can seem for people not already familiar with some of this language. So I just wanted to briefly summarize Bernardo's basic position as I understand it, and I'm fairly confident that he would agree with this summary. So all of reality on this view is mind. That is to say, there's nothing outside of mind. There's no objective, observer, independent universe. And reality is not made of matter as its fundamental constituent, but rather of mind or consciousness as its fundamental constituent. And this in no way denies all the findings of physics or any of them, and in no way denies the findings of chemistry, biology, and so on. And let's remember, Bernardo worked at CERN, the foremost physics laboratory in the world, and he hasn't changed his mind about the value of science. Rather, he understands that what science measures and examines is really behavior. That is to say, behavior of elementary particles, subatomic particles, um, the behaviors of all kinds of systems, uh, and these can be studied through the lenses of classical physics, quantum physics, thermodynamics, and so on. And all those studies are valid as far as they go. But physics and other sciences tell us how things behave. They don't tell us the fundamental nature of things. So physicists are loath to admit, but if pressed, will admit that they don't know what matter actually is. They know how it behaves. So when scientists speak as if the philosophical view called materialism or physicalism is true, they're simply making an assumption because it's a very common assumption in our culture, and therefore they don't think it needs to be defended, and often they don't even think about it at all. But it is, in fact, a metaphysical assumption to believe or state that physical matter is what is fundamental and mind or consciousness is not. So according to materialism, consciousness is an emergent property of a complex organization of organic matter, such as a brain. And as an emergent property, it is epiphenomenal. That is to say, it's not the fundamental thing. And of course, the consciousness only view puts it rather the other way around, that consciousness is fundamental and matter is part of what appears within consciousness. Okay, so to understand why this view is plausible from a scientific point of view, the first thing we have to explain is what is the status of that which lies beyond our own individual minds. So we can all agree that there appear to be planets and galaxies and trees and mountains and so on that are not the contents of any individual mind alone. That is to say, of course, individuals perceive galaxies and trees and so on, But do they exist only within individual minds? No. If they did only exist within individual minds, we would have no good explanation for why our experience of things like trees and uh, galaxies and so on are so well coordinated. That is to say, we have more or less the same sensory experiences of these things. So there's such a thing that Bernardo calls mind at large, and the tantric tradition calls sometimes Shiva. Swami Lakshmanju called it God consciousness. So whatever we call it, there are things that exist that are not limited to uh, individual perceptions of them. So those are the things that most scientists believe are physical and material and exist independently of any observer. But according to the view we're speaking of here, we need to understand the status of these apparently external objects differently. That is to say, they are the images that appear to us of the mental processes of mind at large. That is to say, the spinning galaxies and uh, all the phenomena we observe on Earth, the weather, trees growing, all of it is what the mental processes of mind at large look like. And of course, people who are even slightly religiously inclined are going to agree that the word God is perhaps better than mind at large if we understand that we're not speaking of a supernatural person as posited by Western monotheistic religions. So this mind at large does not constitute a person. So we cannot think of God in that limited way. Indeed, here, what we mean by God is just the fact that all the phenomena that we perceive are contained within a single vast consciousness. But it's not a personal consciousness. It doesn't have personal traits or characteristics. It doesn't plan the universe in advance. It doesn't do things out of a whim. It rather, all that appears within the universe is simply the unfolding of its innate potentialities and cannot be known in advance, even by itself. So this mind at large is, according to Bernardo and some others, is not metacognitive. It's not a mind that thinks about itself. In other words, God does not have an ego. And so that is a very different kind of consciousness than most human beings experience. Okay, so once again, on this view, everything that you perceive that's apparently external constitute images of the mental processes and emotional processes, if you like, of that one mind at large. But we are not separate from that one because each one of us is conscious precisely because of that wider consciousness. We are conscious only to the degree that we participate in that wider consciousness. So there's no separation whatsoever. And Bernardo, as well as many other teachers, use the metaphor of the whirlpool, that a whirlpool that maintains itself for some duration of time is a specific structure. That is to say, it's the water flowing in a specific pattern. And if it flows consistently enough in that way, we might even name it. We might even call it, well, this whirlpool is called whatever, if it lasts long enough. But it is nothing but the water of the river or the ocean in which it appears. It is that same water in a localized structure. So in the same way, every human being is nothing but the wider consciousness in a localized structure. And so this whirlpool metaphor is elaborated in great detail in Bernardo's book, Why Materialism is Baloney, where he stretches the metaphor as far as it can go, but it's a good metaphor as far as metaphors go. Okay, so in the talk, in the conversation you heard, Bernardo used the phrase dissociation and related terms, and that can lead to some misunderstanding that I want to clear up here. This is not dissociation in the psychological sense that you've heard about, probably, but rather he's using the metaphor of dissociative identity disorder to talk about something that's not a disorder, but rather simply the nature of reality. So let me explain that. DID, or dissociative identity disorder, is what used to be called split personality disorder. So this is when a person has multiple personalities, some of which are not aware of each other, and some of which are. And a person could have, even a dozen different personalities. And when each personality is in control of the body, it exhibits quite different traits. It might have a different accent, a different way of speaking, different behaviors, physical behaviors. And it can even be the case, and this has been documented, that one personality is blind while the others can see. And so there was a study done using MRI technology that Bernardo was very interested in, because the study showed that when the personality that's blind is in control of the body, then it really is blind. That is to say, they were able to see in the MRI machine that there was no activity in the visual cortex of the brain, that personality was absolutely experiencing real blindness. It wasn't just a claim. So this is very significant, because it means that there can be very distinctive cognitive changes when one personality versus another is in control. And the other fact that helps fill out the metaphor here is that it can even happen that one personality is dreaming and sees the other personalities, called alters in modern psychological terminology. So one alter can be dreaming and see one or more of the other personalities or other alters and interact with them in the dream world. Now, later, if a different personality is in control of the body, then that alter will remember the dream from their point of view, not from the original alter's point of view. So, okay, this then provides us with a perfect metaphor, because we can understand human beings as dissociated alters of mind at large. Okay, dissociated means they don't know that they are God, that most human beings don't experience or know that they are God, and so they're dissociated, but they nevertheless are alters, or as it were, split personalities of that one consciousness. So this is not to suggest that mind at large, or God, has a mental illness, but rather it's simply a metaphor that this is how it operates, that it acquires the capacity to be metacognitive through embodiment, and each embodied form experiences itself as if dissociated, even though it's really not. And each one is like an alter of the whole organism. And those alters can see different sorts of things, can have different sorts of experiences, just like one alter of the DID patient can be blind and the others not. And those different sorts of experiences don't in any way contradict the fact that that all of us are dissociated alters of the one mind or the one consciousness. Okay, so this is really just a brief summary so that the various things Bernardo was saying can be more clear to the listener. And there's a lot more to learn about this. And Bernardo has a wonderful course on YouTube. And that course is 10 parts, I believe, and introduces you to all the fundamental concepts of idealism, the philosophy that everything is mind or consciousness, or as Bernardo calls it, analytic idealism, because this view can be arrived at through reason as well as through mystical experience. So this was a long episode, but I'm sure worthwhile for some of you. Let us know in the comments on the YouTube version any feedback you have on this or any episode. So if you listen on Spotify or other sources that don't have a comments section, then just go to YouTube and leave your comments there. And thank you for listening.
Hope you enjoyed the episode. Remember, you can always find out more about the tradition of non-dual Shaiva Tantra at tantrailluminated.org, where, if you wish, you can become a subscriber to our online learning portal, and you'll receive access to a vast number of recordings, including a comprehensive curriculum in tantric philosophy, tantric yoga, guided meditation, and much, much more. Music for the podcast composed and recorded by Ann Leader. Find her at annleader.com. Podcast produced by Grazia Tribulato. New episodes drop every week, and may all beings benefit.